But first, again tonight, more revelations about evidence that should have been provided to the Coate Inquiry into Victoria's catastrophic hotel quarantine failures, but it wasn't. It goes to the heart of how serious this inquiry is about finding out the truth, how serious this government is about telling the truth, and whether yesterday's extraordinary hearing and its demand for more evidence by affidavit, not oral testimony, now that's important, I'll get to that in a moment, is the start of this inquiry finally doing the job that every Victorian demands they do. Or is it just another step to give the appearance of effort when in fact it's still headed for the same whitewashed result that I feared a couple of weeks ago when I turned up to the Premier's daily press conference for the first time? That was Friday, not even 2 weeks ago. Not even 2 weeks ago. And let's not forget what had happened earlier that week. On the Monday, instead of calling back Jenny Mikakos, who resigned over that weekend, calling into question the veracity of the Premier's evidence, well, the Coate Inquiry instead moved straight into closing statements from counsel assisting. Now, in layman's terms, they basically shut down the inquiry. To say I was surprised, well, that's an understatement. So too were dozens of lawyers, indeed QCs, also watching that Monday to see where things would go after such a shock resignation on the Saturday from Mikakos. It was also this Monday that we heard the rubbish of a creeping assumption that somehow no one in government knew much about the decision to use private security in Melbourne's COVID hotels, and those that did, like former Police Chief Graham Ashton, who knew about it but then couldn't remember who had told him. I mean, come in, spinner. No one who's worked inside the belly of government would fall for a furphy like creeping assumption. Government just doesn't even work like that. But you know what? The Andrews government, they almost got away with it. That's why I turned up on that Friday, not even 2 weeks ago. That's why I pursued the whole issue of the phone records. Because when I read and reread the evidence that week, cross-referencing the different versions of the truth, that's when the penny dropped for me. That the Coate Inquiry not only didn't have the complete phone records for Mr Ashton and his evidence, it was worse than that. That they hadn't even sought them in the first place for him or barely any other of the key witnesses. That was my motivation. That's why I turned up at the Premier's 99th press conference. That's why I pushed him so hard to concede on camera that if the inquiry was to ask for his phone records and those of his senior officials, he'd hand them over. And that's what he said. I wanted the Coate Inquiry to have little option but to chase down these records because they should have been sought at the outset. They should have been sought but weren't. And it was those phone records that set in train this whole recent series of events. That this inquiry has now been blown wide open. That's what's happened. That the creeping assumption, well, that's all gone. That this demand for new information that's forced the resignation of the Premier's own head of his department, Chris Eccles, that's there, isn't it? And more resignations will come. And out of it, finally, we might start to get this inquiry to do what it should have been doing from day one, searching for the truth. Who knew what, who did what and why, all the decisions that led to Victoria going it alone and establishing a hotel quarantine system that was always going to fail as soon as it went ahead without using police or military personnel. So was yesterday's Coate special hearing a whimper or a roar? Was it a sign that finally this is the sort of inquiry that Australia's 800 dead and their families deserve? Or was it just more of the same sort of whimper that we've had for days and days and days, for that report that was basically almost written 10 days ago on the falsehood of a creeping assumption? If this inquiry is a roar, it needs to do a whole lot more than just seek affidavits, as it only did yesterday. Now, to be fair income, to show it's not a whitewash, Coate must recall witnesses. Call those they haven't even called, like Unified Security's David Millward and the Premier's Chief of Staff, and put their evidence to the test under oath. Now, on this, there's some legal technical points that are worth making. For those of you who aren't lawyers, an affidavit like that sought by Coate yesterday, is just a written response to a whole lot of questions. It might be signed by the person of interest in the inquiry, the bureaucrat, let's say, or the government minister. But make no mistake, they don't write it, it's not their words. It gets drafted by their lawyers and it's done with every single word carefully weighed. It's why all the MPs and public servants are literally spending millions of taxpayer dollars on legal assistance for this inquiry, all protecting their collective backsides with a phalanx of QCs and law firms. Last week, in fact, I costed it all up, $30,000 per minister per day and around $30,000 per department per day. Your money, Victoria, and these bills have been racking up for months. Now, right now, all Coate is after are these affidavits, signed and sworn on oath by the witness, but drafted by the lawyers. And unless they are then tested, these witnesses, by putting them in the box and forensically asking them questions that their lawyer can't answer for them, then unless that happens, we're a long way away from getting the full picture. It might have seemed like a small difference yesterday when this was said in the Coate hearing, but I hope you can now understand how important it is that this inquiry puts key witnesses back in the box, test and retest their evidence in light of what we now know that we didn't know before. For example, back in August, Victoria's Emergency Management Commissioner Andrew Crisp told a parliamentary inquiry that he had briefed his Police Minister, Lisa Neville, that he briefed her regularly as his quarantine crisis evolved. Indeed, he said in evidence that he usually briefed her daily in times of emergency. Now, that's hardly remarkable, you'd think, given he's required to do so by law under the state's Emergency Management Act. And this, of course, don't forget, from the 16th of March onwards, was a time of declared state of emergency in Victoria. Hardly remarkable, as I said, for him to confirm this, and he did confirm it 3 separate times to the parliamentary inquiry. And there in the hearing, not disputing in any way his evidence, was his minister, Lisa Neville. It was only after Neville told the Coate Inquiry later in September that she in fact was never briefed by Mr Crisp that alarm bells rang for me and others. But of course, it gets worse, doesn't it? When suddenly people inside the government must realise that if people like me go digging, they will discover the discrepancy between what Crisp said in August about the briefings and what the minister said under oath to Coate a month later. So what then happens? Well, 6 weeks after his evidence to the parliamentary inquiry, Andrew Crisp recants it all. He says he never briefed his minister, as is required under law. He never briefed her, he says, on the 27th and 28th of March, when all of these decisions about hotel quarantine and security guards get made. You want my view? I don't buy it. I don't buy any of it at all. Andrew Crisp isn't just a dispensable staffer or a departmental secretary that can be removed at political whim. He's a statutory officer. He's employed under a special act of Parliament, technically, by the Governor of Victoria. And under Section 32 of that Act, he must brief his minister in times of major emergencies. Now, as I said, Victoria's already in a declared state of emergency. Doesn't get any major than that. Now, if he now says he didn't do this, this is not a question of whether the Premier does or doesn't have confidence in Commissioner Crisp. Under the Emergency Management Act, Crisp should be stood aside under Section 29 for neglect of duty. That's not me saying that. That's the law in Victoria, and the government knows it. Because Crisp, well, he's been all but hidden from view. All of this conflicting evidence is why Andrew Crisp must be recalled, not chased down via affidavit, but back under oath in the stand. Yesterday's Sutton emails, well, they show, as I said last night, that he knew about the use of private security back on the 27th of March, the same day as the National Cabinet decision. Even though he's told Coate in sworn evidence, he didn't know about private security at all until months and months later. Remember, he didn't just receive these emails. Brett Sutton responded. But it's what else is in these emails that Sutton got and exchanged that's interesting. The emails confirm that after the Prime Minister offered ADF support to establish the system of hotel quarantine, and after the Premier himself, in his own press release that same day, here it is again, said, and I quote, it will be agreed that the Australian Defence Force will be engaged to support the implementation of these arrangements, quarantine arrangements. Well, the Sutton emails show that Victoria knocked back ADF support the very day the PM offered it. Now, the Premier likes to say that if he'd known about the PM's offer, he said this in his evidence to Coate, he might have acted differently. But he did know. It was in his own press release. And the PM, well, he made it crystal clear that day.
The ADF will be there to put boots on the ground, to support them in their enforcement efforts, and I thank the ADF for their great support in turning up to this task.
Now, we also know when he was chairing the State Control Centre meeting later that same day, Andrew Crisp, well, he said that using defence was out. Now, coincidentally, when I went back and read the evidence again, the testimony, not long before he said that defence was out, he stepped out of the meeting to take an urgent phone call from the Premier. Now, beyond Sutton's knowledge that private security will be used months and months and months before he told the Coate Inquiry he knew about it, these new emails released yesterday also show how hard Canberra tried to follow up the offer of ADF support. It's all there in black and white. Sandra Jeffrey, Senior Director of the Commonwealth Government's COVID-19 Task Force inside the Department of Home Affairs, well, she was chasing Victoria late on Friday, the 27th of March, wanting to get their decision on the deployment of the ADF. Now, you can imagine, can't you? She hears the Premier say it's all been agreed. She sees the press release. But she keeps being told a different story out of all of these rolling meetings occurring throughout that afternoon. Now, she knows too that other states and territories are taking up their deployments. She knows that the Chief of the Defence Force, the CDF, has already issued a stand-up order for Australia's military to get ready. So just before 5:30, she's chasing Brett Sutton for Victoria's answer, asking Brett Sutton via email, do you require support from the Commonwealth to put these arrangements in place by midnight 28th of March? If so, what support do you require? Sent to Brett Sutton, sent to him directly. And the reply by Braden Hogan on Sutton's behalf says, and I quote, the ADF is currently providing planning support to Victoria at the State Control Centre, same centre run by Crisp, I might add, but no further support required. In this same email, Victoria confirms and Sutton knows, despite what he's told Coate, again, private security will be used in these hotels. Now, today, it doesn't surprise me that Brett Sutton was nowhere to be seen at the Premier's media conference. Right now, based on this evidence alone and claims that he was the one that instructed lawyers to withhold some of these crucial emails, Brett Sutton must resign. For the next 7 days, he'll use his clever lawyers to draft up the affidavit Coate demanded yesterday, and that's why Sutton himself must be back in the witness box. He's got to be put under some real pressure so we find out the truth. So too should Andrew Crisp. Because I don't believe someone who briefed his minister as regularly as he said he did failed to do it over these 2 critical days. And if I'm right on that, then Lisa Neville, the Police Minister, she has misled the Coate Inquiry and she must go. Now, all of this is important because tomorrow night I'm going to show you, I'm going to explain how when things all started to go so catastrophically wrong, when the virus got out of these COVID hotels and started Victoria's second wave, the Emergency Management Commissioner, Andrew Crisp, he tried to bring in the Army to Victoria. June 24 and 25, critical dates when 850 military personnel were asked for, agreed, and on their way to Victoria, but then overturned by the politicians. This is where the greatest failures of the Andrews government and the greatest pretence come from the Premier. But as you can see tonight, substituting private security for police and rejecting the military, all of that happened many, many months earlier. Indeed, all of it on day one, Friday the 27th of March. Now, before I go, just let me say this. I couldn't give a toss about any debate amongst media insiders about what title I do or I don't have. All I know is I am here 5 nights a week. I write a national newspaper column and I do radio across the country. So broadcaster or former political staffer, lawyer, journalist, whatever you want to call me, doesn't matter to me. To be honest, Twitter, if that's your obsession, knock yourself out. But let me just say this. For 98 press conferences before me, anyone who does want to call themselves a journalist, well, they could have asked the question that I did. So the only title I'll wear on this issue, on justice for the dead, is determined. To me, getting to the truth is all that matters. Anything else is just a sideshow. And I'm not going to be distracted. I'm going to take a deep dive into Victoria's hotel quarantine catastrophe. We're going to have a special program on this. Sky News special program. It will investigate how the flawed decision-making inside the government led to the use of private security guards instead of police and Defence Force personnel used everywhere else around the country. Because Victoria's decision to go it alone has had disastrous consequences for more than 800 dead, 5 million Melbourne residents that are suffering the longest and toughest lockdowns in the world, and an economy that's on its knees. That's special, don't miss it. Sunday the 1st of November, here on Sky News at 8 p.m.